So thank you and welcome everyone. Today we're here to mark the release of the third set of Fairwork ratings for Cloudwork platforms. This year we have evaluated 15 web-based platform sectors against the 5 principles of Fairwork and given them a score out of 10 based on the quality of the work that they provide. We hope that these scores will raise awareness of the conditions of online remote workers and assist workers, consumers, and regulators in making platforms accountable for their practices and help create a world of fair platform work. Next. Pablo. Thank you so much. Before handing over to Fairwork Director, Professor Mark Graham, here are some quick housekeeping notes. We request that everyone's opinions and perspectives are respected in this space. This event is being recorded. The recording will be available after the event. Your questions will be answered at the end of the session. Please use the Zoom Q&A to send your questions. And the report is now available at fair.work. And now, Professor Mark Graham.
Thanks, Jonas, and hi everyone, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to give a bit of background about the Fairwork project, about how we do what we do, why we do what we do, before handing back to Jonas, who will give us the results of the study that we've been working on together. So what we do in the Fairwork project is we study the gig economy. And before I tell you how we do that, let me explain what I mean by that term. So it's usually taken to mean some combination of relatively short-term jobs or gigs, work that's outside of the employment relationship, and work that's mediated in some way by a centralized digital platform. So I wrote a book a few years ago called The Gig Economy, and it was sort of a response to the idea that the gig economy was this inevitable outcome of platformization. And Pablo, if you can just move to the next slide, thanks. And that work mediated by platforms had to be organized through the gig model. So what we did in this book was we showed that the gig economy is brought into being by a whole range of not just technological, but also social, political, and economic factors. So the gig economy is not inevitable, in other words, and nor does it have to be the organizational model that is used by platforms. But that said, it's extremely widespread. It's a model that's been introduced all over the world. It's a model that we see in 2 quite different types of work. So in the first type of work, you can think of it as geographically tethered work or place-based work or local platform work. So this is work that has to be done from a particular place. And this can be anything from babysitting to taxi driving to cleaning to food delivery. Then the second type of work you can think of as cloud work or online remote work. This is work that in theory can be done from anywhere. So this could be microtasks like image labeling, translation, transcription. It could be design work. It could even be meeting a doctor or meeting a tutor or meeting a physical trainer remotely. Now, I'm going to be mostly speaking about geographically tethered work in this introduction, and then Jonas will focus us more on cloud work or online remote work. Now, as ever more jobs out there are becoming part of the gig economy, as ever more jobs are becoming mediated by platforms, as ever more workers work in the gig economy, one thing that you hear from platform companies is that this is really a liberatory innovation for workers. And we get companies spending really an enormous, staggering amount of resources conveying this message, trying to persuade consumers and regulators and even workers themselves that this is a desirable future of work. But that message is really only a selective part of the picture. And that's one of the key things that we want to start this introduction with. So I have been studying platform-mediated work for about a decade now. I've conducted interviews and carried out surveys with hundreds of workers. And in all of that research, what my colleagues, what my team, and what I have done, we can tell you that in some ways, the platform companies, they're partially right. Workers, of course, they value their jobs. They value having flexibility in their jobs. But that isn't the full story. So in that research that we did, what my team and I discovered were really a whole range of risks and harms that are experienced by platform workers. What sorts of risks and harms am I talking about? Well, in some of the slides that follow, what I'll do is give you a sample of the risks and harms that workers experience. On the left of the slide, you're going to see a summary of what those risks and harms are. On the right, we've illustrated each one with the things that workers that we've actually spoken to in our research have told us. So places on platforms, they tend to be classified as independent contractors or self-employed. So they're not employees of the platform companies typically, with some exceptions. Now, this means that it's possible, and indeed it's entirely legal, when the worker is not classified as an employee, to pay them below the local minimum wage. And because earnings can be low and insecure, many workers are then incentivized to work extremely long hours with little rest or little sleep. We get people who we've spoken to working 20+ hour days, for instance. With geographically tethered or local gig work, most workers really have zero power to negotiate rates. With cloud work or online remote work, you do get workers able to negotiate rates, but you often get a race to the bottom dynamic, which is driving down earnings. So many workers get into debt then, as the responsibility to buy equipment or machines or vehicles, whatever they need to do their job, typically falls on them. So platforms typically don't just not employ workers, but also require workers to provide their own equipment. Next, we have unsafe working conditions. So a lot of platform work is just inherently risky. You get with geographically tethered work, you get, for instance, delivery drivers weaving in and out of traffic, you get ride-hail drivers who can be assaulted, you get cleaners who have to go into the homes of strangers. Cloud workers, online remote workers might be working with distressing content, for instance. If anything goes wrong, if there's any harms in any of those cases, if any of these workers can't work, on many platforms, they get no support and no income. And then there's unfair management, and this links to the previous point. So because workers tend not to be employees, there tends not to be any due process when it comes to disciplinary or dismissal procedures. There's a lot of research out there showing that women, ethnic minority, lower caste, religious minorities will tend to get worse scores, worse ratings on platforms. And remember, almost all platforms allow consumers to rate workers. So certain groups will tend to get worse scores and worse ratings because platforms, what they're doing is they will end up reflecting societal biases that manifest through them. And so workers who depend on a platform could be banned from that app if their rating falls below a certain threshold, or they could just simply not get any more jobs because customers don't want to hire someone with a low rating. And so what this all means is that bias and discrimination is effectively built into the system. And then compounding all of this fact is the issue that many workers typically have relatively little collective power. So most platforms do whatever they can to engage with workers as individuals, rather than negotiating with groups or collectives or associations or unions. And what this means is that it allows platforms, should they wish to unilaterally degrade wages and working conditions. Now, in most places, in most sectors, most platform workers don't have the sort of collective associational structural power that you might see in other sectors of the economy. So platform workers are effectively in a structurally weak bargaining position. Now, the point then is that most workers in most sectors in most of the world remain pretty unprotected by and large by either governments who haven't yet developed the sort of legal protections for workers, or trade unions because of the weak structurally weak position that they're in from this whole range of risks and harms that I've outlined. And it's from that realization that we started our project, the Fairwork project. So it's a reaction to the risks and the harms that I've been speaking about. And as a reaction to all of them, what we set out to do in the Fairwork project is give every platform a score out of 10, which is simply based on how fair or how decent the working conditions on the platform are. And then we use that score as a way of incentivizing decent work and disincentivizing indecent work. And let me tell you how we do that. So we currently work in 38 countries spread around every corner of the globe. You can see that we have teams in the Americas, Africa, Europe, and Asia, all the red countries on this map. In each of those countries, we work with a local partner, and we coordinate the whole network from the University of Oxford and the Berlin Social Science Center. And in some of the countries, the teams that we work with, they will have their own funding to do the research. So we give thanks in Austria, for instance, to their Chamber of Labor, in Italy to a Confederation of Trade Unions, in the US, the Ford Foundation. But the bulk of work that we do in low and middle income countries, in 24 of them, is funding provided by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, together with their partner, the GIZ, who also have funded the report that we are releasing today, the Cloudwork research. Now, in each of these countries around the world, what we do then is we evaluate platforms against 5 Fair Work principles. And these principles were developed at a tripartite workshop, a set of tripartite workshops that we initially held in the start of the project, and then we keep refining them through in-country consultations with stakeholders around the world. Now, these principles that we've developed, they don't represent what you might think of as a gold-plated utopian understanding of what work should be. These aren't gold-plated jobs that we're asking for. These principles that we've outlined, they really just ask for basic minimum standards in jobs, basic minimum standards that guarantee basic dignity at work. Let me tell you what they are. So they stipulate that no worker, irrespective of what they're doing, where they're doing it, or the type of contractual arrangement through which they're doing it, should be paid below the local minimum wage. That all workers should be protected from foundational risks that arise from the work that they're doing. That workers are provided with clear and understandable contracts. That decisions about them can be fairly appealed, that there are meaningful anti-discrimination policies in place, and that they have access to some form of collective representation. So those are the principles for geographically tethered or local place-based platform work: fair pay, fair conditions, fair contracts, fair management, and fair representation. And if you're interested in really seeing how we outline them in lots of detail, you can look at them on our website, fair.work. We also have similar but slightly different principles for cloud work, online remote work, which Jonas is going to talk us through shortly. So I won't talk about these in detail. Now, the Fair Work principles, they form the basis for how we score platforms. So each Fair Work principle is broken down into 2 points. There's a basic point and then a more advanced point that can only be awarded if the basic point has been fulfilled. Now, every platform receives the score out of 10, and platforms are only given a point when they can satisfactorily demonstrate their implementation of the principles. So what that means is that failing to achieve a point, it doesn't necessarily mean that a platform doesn't comply with the principle in question. It simply means that there's insufficient evidence to evidence its compliance. Now, the way that we collect data is through a triangulation of methods. We look at contracts and terms and conditions to see what is promised or guaranteed to the worker. We speak to workers themselves, and then we speak to managers at companies. We go to them with a draft score. We ask them for evidence in any areas where they think they might deserve a point, where we haven't given them one yet. And what's important about these conversations with the companies is that they're not just a moment for data gathering, but a point of negotiation. So what happens frequently is that companies will ask us not just what they need to do to give us evidence, but what they need to do to make a change to get the score that we're talking about. And we do all this, we wrap all this together in league tables that we publish each year in each country. So what we do in the league tables is we directly compare the scores of every platform against every other platform. And what this means is it allows consumers, workers, regulators to see that the platform economy, to see that platform work is not black or white. So in some countries, the tables show us that some companies are stepping up and others are not. So they show that really that there's nothing inevitable about indecent, unfair work. And What you're looking at on the screen here are the tables for India and for Ecuador in 2022. And again, Jonas will show you the Cloudwork score, so I'm not going to say much about that yet. You can see last year's ones here on the screen. Now, one of the most important things that these tables typically show is just how much needs to be done to bring about fair work. So these tables, these league tables, they're basically all snapshots of the market left to itself under current regulation. So what they show us is that under current regulation, or typically under the lack of current regulation, this is what companies are willing to do. So you get some companies willing to step up, but a few companies willing to guarantee dignity and fair work for workers, and a lot not willing to do that. So by doing all of this, by repeatedly scoring platforms year after year in each market, and also globally through the Cloudwork project, we've had quite a few impacts in this project. So to date, through our negotiations with companies, there have been 163 pro-worker changes to policies and practices that have been implemented by platforms, again, in response to our engagement with them. So these are changes that have really impacted the jobs of millions of workers. And let me just give you, actually, I think Jonas will give you a sample of them later. So the last thing that I'll say is one additional way in which we think that it's crucial to try and institutionalize the need for decent work through our approach is through an initiative that we call the Fairwork Pledge. So the pledge basically asks organizations to signal that they are paying attention to the Fair Work scores. It's a bit like how most organizations now ask their staff to take modes of transport that aren't ecologically destructive for work. So at my job at the University of Oxford, when we travel, we're asked to take trains instead of planes for domestic travel. And the reason why we're asked to do that is because trains, of course, are less ecologically destructive than planes. So what we're doing here is we're asking organizations to prioritize platforms that aren't socially destructive. So asking organizations to encourage staff to use better scoring platforms. It's free to sign up to the pledge. It's open to companies, to charities, to universities, to religious organizations, pretty much any organizational form. We've gotten organizations like GIZ, the Church of England, the New Economics Foundation, the Berlin Senate, and dozens of other organizations around the world to sign it. Having more signatories then helps us immensely when we go back to the companies each year. So what we tell them is, look at all of these organizations that are starting to pay attention to your Fair Work score. It needs to improve. It's not just us that cares about this. So if any of you listening are interested in joining these organizations and signing the pledge, just go to that link at the bottom of the screen or be in touch with me or Jonas directly. Now, as I said earlier, at the end of the day, we're not asking really for a sort of utopian future with these Fair Work principles. These are basic minimum standards that every worker, irrespective of where they are, what they're doing, how they're classified, every single worker should benefit from these minimum standards. And if our scores tell us anything, it's that these minimum standards are not being realized. So I hope that everyone listening, whether you manage a platform, whether you're a platform worker, whether you're a regulator or a policymaker, whether you're simply a user or a consumer of these services, can help us arrive at that fairer future of work. So thanks, and I will hand over to Jonas right now.
Thank you, Mark. And then I'm going to go through our findings of the Cloudwork report. And the Fairwork Cloudwork report 2023, or as we call it, the Fairwork Cloudwork Ratings 2023, rates fairness in the working conditions of 15 web-based digital labor platforms. For our survey, we interviewed 752 workers from 94 countries. In addition, we talked to several platform managers who contributed crucial evidence. Next. Thanks. Platforms were assessed according to our 5 Cloudwork principles. This set of standards was adapted to the specific features of web-based platforms. For instance, Principle 1 includes mechanisms to ensure workers are paid on time and for all work completed. In Principle 2, we verified, among other things, if the allocation of work and supply of new workers is managed to promote job availability and reduce unpaid work and overwork. In Principle 3, we check if workers can choose their tasks and shadows. Next. The platforms studied in this report were selected based on their global reach, their position as regional market leaders, and companies focused on specific sectors. This year, 2 new platforms were scored: Fairwork, which operates in African countries, and El Harefa from the MENA region. This year's scores show that platforms are still far from safeguarding the basic standards of fair work in our 5 principles. 3 platforms scored 5 points out of 10. For the other 12 platforms, we were unable to evidence that they met any more than 3 of our 10 thresholds. For 4 platforms, we could not find evidence that they met any threshold. Next, please. The thresholds with more points awarded this year were 1.1, about ensuring workers are paid for completed work with 6 platforms, 4.1, about providing communications channels, due process, and appeals channels with 6 platforms as well, and 2.1, which assesses measures to mitigate precarity and labor oversupply with 4 platforms. Let's see the findings per principle now. Next. We were able to evidence that 6 platforms had systems in place to ensure that workers were paid in a timely manner for all the work they completed. The point for threshold 1.2, which states workers should earn at least the local minimum wage, was awarded to 2 platforms, which adopted changes to implement this policy. Next. 4 platforms were awarded points in the first threshold, as we found evidence of measures to avoid unreasonable levels of competitions between workers and overwork. Out of the 4 platforms that were awarded 2.1, only 2 received an additional point for 2.2, mitigating health and safety risks. Next. Thanks. Our research found evidence that 3 platforms met all the bullet points for 3.1, related to clear and available terms and conditions and contracts. From those platforms, 2 received a further point for threshold 3.2. Contracts are consistent with the workers' terms of engagement on the platform. Next. Thank you. We were able to evidence that 6 platforms met all our criteria for threshold 4.1, when there is a due process for decisions affecting workers. We were unable to award a point for 4.2 to any of the platforms this year, when there is equity in the management process. Next. 2 platforms were awarded a point for fair representation related to the recognition of and engagement with collective workers' bodies. We were unable to award the second point. There is collective governance or bargaining to any of the platforms evaluated this year. Next, please. So let me talk a little bit about our theming focus this year. One focus of the report this year was that workers doing tasks such as data labeling and content moderation for AI systems. This work is essential for the development of recent tech such as ChatGPT and other AI relevant systems that are spreading across society, but often remains invisible and unregulated. This year's report shows that microworkers continue to face precarious conditions and challenges related to multiple aspects covered by our principles and thresholds. As our scorecard shows, unfortunately, microwork platforms had among the worst results. Appen with 3 points, Clickworker and Scale remote tasks, both with 1 point, and microworkers and Amazon Mechanical Turk, both with 0 points. Considering almost 250 workers interviewed, the report survey has shown that they spent on average 23 hours and 30 minutes on those platforms. Out of this time, workers dedicated 17 hours and 12 minutes to paid tasks and 6 hours and 18 minutes to unpaid tasks, the equivalent of almost 27% of the whole time. Considering the average working hours reported, this group of workers, microworkers on microwork platforms, They earned an average of $2.15 an hour, which is consistent with other research studies and investigations about the situation of micro workers. Next. This year, several platforms implemented changes in regard to different principles and thresholds. Following conversations with the Fairwork team, in total, platforms adopted 17 changes in the last 12 months. Next. Appen reported improvements, Come Up and Fairwork have implemented a policy to ensure workers get paid at least the minimum wage, which is incredibly important for workers. Next. Appen reported improvements in managing job availability, which is also a feature that is very challenging for cloud workers. And Come Up amended its terms of use and clauses prohibiting abusive behavior. Next. Come Up and Fairwork amended their terms of service to insert the provision of a 30-day notice before a contract change comes into effect. Fairwork updated its FAQ section with a guideline to ensure clients inform workers how their work will be used, and Soy Freelancer added rights and guarantees to workers when they cancel their participation in a job. Next, please. Appen reported new rules to make the appeal process less arduous. Fairwork updated its terms to avoid summary sanctions at its own discretion and specified methods used to allocate work. Fairwork and Come Up implemented anti-discrimination policies, and Soy Freelancer documented the appeal process. And finally, next, Appen informed the change in its terms to narrow rules on indemnification in a way that they do not restrict workers' rights to present claims. Next. Thank you, and now we'll hear from our invited speakers. Let me introduce them. Dr. Janine Berg is a senior economist, and she received her PhD from the New School for Social Research in New York, USA. She has been working for over 20 years at Inclusive Labor Markets, Labor Relations, and Working Conditions branch of the International Labor Organization. Thank you so much, Janine, for being here with us today. Mr. Gathigi Kibugi is a country director for Digital Opportunities Trust Kenya and the founding trustee of We Create Kenya. She has over 15 years experience across East Africa development sector, and she has also expertise in the gig economy and digital inclusion landscape. Let's start with Dr. Janine Berg. Janine, please.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And really a big round of applause to Mark and Jonas and the whole Fairwork team for carrying out this work, not just for this report that was recently published, but for all the reports that you've been doing over these past years. I remember when the Fairwork was just an idea in Mark's eyes. And so it's really amazing to see how far it's come. All of the countries that you have projects in, all of the platforms that you've been engaging in, all the reports that you've done. It's been a really a tremendous effort, and not just an impactful effort, because what's really nice about seeing these reports and what's really nice about hearing your presentation is how it's affected change, how you see actually some platforms that are changing their terms of service, that are really changing the way they're doing their business, the way they're managing the workers to have a more dignified world of work. Of course, we still have a lot to do, but it shows that change is possible. And it really shows as well the importance of speaking to workers, finding out about their situation, of speaking to the platforms, of pointing out to them what are maybe some of the deficiencies, and moving forward in a way that's really positive. So, I mean, this is a huge service for the workers, but I think this is actually ultimately a really huge service for the platforms, because to me, this seems like a tremendous amount of very useful information for people who start platforms. And they're entrepreneurs. They start these platforms. They see a market niche. They do this work, and sometimes they don't think about some of the implications of the way their systems are designed. So it's really great to have this important feedback and this iterative process. This report on Cloudwork in particular, I think, has come out at a really good time, because there's been so much emphasis in the press lately on large language models, ChatGPT, and recently also finally attention on the role that these invisible workers are playing in training these systems. For too long there was this assumption that AI would actually, some of these workers were needed, for especially when they were being used more in the areas of e-commerce and certain, let's say, websites for rating certain things, that eventually that would be their work wouldn't be necessary because they would be automated. But we're seeing what some computer scientists have said for a long time, but with every technological advance, you need a human. You need a human to do work and to make sure the systems function the way they should be functioning. So we know now, I think there now is a better understanding, hopefully, that this labor is not going to be going away. If anything, it's going to be expanding. We see that the world of AI is actually expanding, and so there's going to be these needed workers. And in fact, these are the new jobs. These are, we talk about the future of work, the new jobs that are coming up, and these are the new jobs. And so we have an obligation in the policy sphere to make sure that these new jobs are good jobs. So this work is really, really important in that respect. And it's also important because, as many of you on the call will know, in 2015 at the ILO, the organization where I work, we will start a 2-year standard setting discussion on decent work in the platform economy. So this is going to be a tripartite negotiation to have a standard that will govern the working conditions in the platform economy. Cloudwork will most likely be included within the scope of these discussions. And so having this information and having these consultative processes that the Fairwork Association has done will be is going to be a very useful for enriching the debate, for increasing our knowledge of what are the working conditions, but also showing the ways forward of how things can be improved. So that's I think that's the most significant really of this work that you've been doing. I think the 5 main criteria and with the 2 subcomponents that make for the 10 criteria is really, it's well thought out. And it shows really importantly how some things really haven't received the attention that they should. It struck me that in your findings that within the topic of fair management, that there wasn't one platform that could assure equity in the management process, that there really actually is discrimination on many of these platforms. Of course, non-discrimination is a fundamental principle and right that all governments and members of the ILO adhere to by being members of the organization. So it shows really that more needs to be done. More safeguards need to be put in place to ensure non-discrimination. But the other thing that I really thought was interesting was the best practice example that you gave for the Come Up platform that was renamed the French platform, and how it jumped so much in 1 year's time, and it really just shows the important advances that could be made. So that's pretty much all of my feedback. I just say to you and the rest of the team, congratulations and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berg, and for your insightful comments. And I would like to highlight that this process in ILO for the approval and discussion of an international convention is seen by Cloudwork as something that is crucial. And it's crucial, especially when we talk about Cloudwork. And Fairwork participated of an effort of hundreds of researchers last year who launched a global manifesto defending this convention. And we keep discussing with other academic networks how we can collaborate with this process, because we understand that researchers all around the globe can feed in the discussion to help workers' associations, platforms, and governments on how to think those clauses, those guidelines, because they are essential. A second point that I would like to comment on that is that you highlighted what we call the threshold 4.2 on equity on the management process. And this is interesting, and we explained this in the report because each one of the thresholds, they have a series of bullet points of criteria. right? And in the 4.2, we are seeing platforms moving forward, implementing anti-discrimination policies. Of course, that there are not all the platforms doing this still, but around 10 platforms already implemented anti-discrimination policies, and we think that this is super positive. But our threshold 4.2 also brings other aspects, such as algorithm transparency and how changes in the methods to allocate work are discussed and if they are subjected to consultation to workers. So this is one point that is more challenging for platforms. And unfortunately, we couldn't find platforms understanding that these changes to those methods needs to be done listening to the workers. So I believe that this was the main reason why we don't have the 4.2 awarded this year. And as Professor Mark Graham explained, to have the 4.2, a platform needs to also have been awarded the 4.1. So our methodology with these 2 points is also something that is important here. But I'm looking forward to continue this discussion during the Q&A. And now I will hand over to Esther Gafigi to hear your comments. Thank you so much, Esther, for being with us today.
Thank you, Jonas, and thank you, everyone. First, a huge congratulations to Mark and the team at Fairwork for the great work you've done. And Jonas, thank you for taking us through the presentation. A lot of it, just going through the report speaks to a lot of what we're finding on the ground, working with gig workers, taking them through understanding of what fair work practices are, realizing that quite a number of them don't even understand the basic tenets of fair work. And it was interesting to just see some of those, especially around the fact that there's most platforms fall short of safeguarding those basic principles of fair work, that and the biases keep being promoted even throughout the platform. So just that it's validating a lot of what we found on the ground. It's interesting to see that while they are platforms that are accepting to listen, not just to the reports and the policies that you're recommending and the changes, but also to include workers. It's something that I think we need to bring out a lot more. How can we give agency and voice to these platform workers? How do we bring them into the fold and have them actually speak out? Because I think that's something that is really critical and is missing within this process and could really support. I think one of the things that would be very interesting to bring out would be what their regional differences. I think that's one thing I would have liked to see. So I know you have work across multiple regions, across multiple continents. It would be interesting to see how the local laws feed into some of the policies that are being created and what impact does that have on the platforms. Because while we do know gig economy is growing more and more, then governments will start implementing policies that are going to affect how these gig workers operate within their economies. So that would be a nuance that would be interesting to see about, how will a platform operate? And we have seen in certain instances, especially around transport, where the platform owners had to make changes based on the community of workers who felt that they were being shortchanged by the platform, and they created they were able to make changes to the platform specific to that specific location. So I think it's interesting to see what once we give agency and voice to this platform workers and gig workers, then what changes are we going to, what changes do we anticipate seeing within the platforms, and how is that going to impact gig work going forward? For me, that bringing in that voice, what I found very important was bringing in that voice of the gig workers, having them participate and interviewing them as well, and then comparing that with what the platform is saying. As just as Janine has said, that the platforms are created by business people. So for them, they're looking at what is my profit, what is my return on investment. But at the back end of that, they are human beings that are interacting with this. And the biases, like we can see, just like you've spoken to, Jonas, very well, that those biases are still going to continue being carried into the platforms, whether it's whether it's creating the new platforms, there is someone behind that who is bringing in their perceived biases into the platform. If it's the algorithms that are distributing work, what are those, what those biases are still being carried out, and I think we can see that reflecting within the report. And great work that you have done so far. So thank you very much. And I think those were my very few comments on the report, and I look forward to interacting more and sharing more insights and interacting more with the report, and coming up, just getting to understand more on how it compares, a lot of the comparisons between what happened last year, what we've seen this year, and going forward in future years. Thank you very much, Jonas.
Thank you so much, Esther. And before I address some of your comments, I would like to remind everyone that is here with us today that please share your questions in the Q&A tool that we have on Zoom. So after this insightful comments from Dr. Janine Berg and Esther, now we'll have the Q&A session. And this is super important to hear from us that are here today, what you thought about these findings, what questions you would like for us to elaborate more on it. And while we already have 2 questions, but I'd like to see if we can have more questions. And while we wait for that, I will address these 2 points, Esther. First of all, we totally agree with you that it's crucial to listen to workers. And I will hand over to Professor Mark Grant to talk more about how Fairwork has been doing that in the project as a whole. But I could just mention that for this Cloudwork Ratings 2023, we ran a survey with 752 workers from 94 countries. So we talked to workers who are in all those platforms, and we listen to their concerns, their challenges. We get information and we get evidence. So sometimes our desk research, as was explained by Professor Mark Grant, we find something, but our survey points out a problem for us. So maybe we can have workers complaining about non-payment. Maybe we can have workers pointing out that the level of competition is too high in the platform, or that the due process, the appeal channels, they don't work, or they are not effective. So the voice of workers is crucial in our methodology to understand better the reality of those platforms and to also engage with platform managers. We have several platform managers here with us today, and we had the opportunity to engage with platform managers from multiple platforms scored this year. And this was also super important because platform managers offer evidence and also open space in some cases, as we saw. For 4 platforms, we had managers opening space and discussing internally changes that reflected in the 17 changes that we had. But we can explore more of that during the questions. I don't know, Professor Mark, would you like to say a little more how the project has been handling the engagement with workers and platform managers?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jonas. And just to say thanks to Esther and Janine for the interventions and the kind comments. In terms of engagement with workers, this is really fundamental to what we do. If the principles do not reflect the needs of platform workers, we may as well pack up and go home. Like that is fundamental to us to make sure that we're doing that. As Jonas said, it's not just the Cloudwork project that we're hearing from workers in. I asked my colleagues a few weeks ago, I was wondering how many workers we've spoken to in this project. And so we tabulated this. And so in the Cloudwork bit of the project, we do surveys, but in the rest of the project, we do interviews, like long form, often face-to-face, but synchronous interviews where we sit down with a worker and we talk to them for hours sometimes. And we've done over 5,000 of those conversations across the world. This is in the 38 countries that we're working in. So 5,000 of these synchronous long-form conversations where we talk to a worker and ask them about how the work is, about their understanding of the work, but also what they wish it to be, not just what the problems are, but what they want their jobs to to look like. So that's a key way, a crucial way that we get an understanding of what workers want. We also, of course, speak to organizations that represent workers. Now, the reason why we do the 5,000 contacts, the 5,000 interviews with workers, is because, as I said earlier, many of the workers on platforms, they're not organized, right? They're not in trade unions. They don't have any sort of representation. And so it's crucial to sort of get this perspective of the individual worker, but we also additionally want the perspective of unions who represent and stand up for workers as a unit, as a collective. So that's something that we do everywhere that we work. We go to unions and we typically ask them two things. We say, first of all, this is what we think our scoring is looking like. And do you know anything we don't know? So, you might know issues that have surfaced on some of these platforms that we would need to know. And once we know those things, we don't then award a point to the platform if we have any reason to suspect that they shouldn't be getting a point, if the information from workers conflicts with the information that we're getting from the company. But we also ask them again about not just what indecent, unfair work is, but what decent, what fair work looks like to them. So we always want the vision of the workers and their unions to be reflected in the principles. And we change, our principles evolve over time, right? So we know that the platform economy is changing. We know it's evolving. And so the principles themselves that we benchmark companies against have to change and evolve. And we have a sort of internal democratic process within our network where each team gets one vote, and we can propose changes to the principles, and then we need sort of a supermajority of teams to ratify any of those changes. So that's just the medium length version of how we do this engagement with workers. And thanks for pointing that out and asking that question.
Thank you, Mark. And I would like to highlight just one other point, that is during one cycle. So when we do the research, when we gather evidence, we also have what we call a stakeholder workshop. So we invite representatives of international organizations such as the ILO, such as other regional organizations, platform managers, unions, workers associations, researchers, and we had this stakeholder workshop. So we present the methodology, we present the principles, the league table, we get input from all those stakeholders, and this is super important. We also engage individually with stakeholders. So as Mark explained, we can engage with a union, we can engage with a platform association, and also now that we are launching now the Cloudwork results, we are open and we will seek those stakeholders to discuss these findings in more detail, and then to get new inputs, not only about the findings, but about the principles and about how we can operationalize them. Janine, please, and then I will go to the 5 questions that we already have.
Yeah, I'm going to take advantage of the space here to ask a question. Mark, at the end of your presentation, you talked about the partners that you have that have basically signed this pledge to adhere to the standards that your organization has developed. Have you approached big tech to be partners? I mean, these are the lead firms that are using these suppliers to train the AI systems. So it would seem that they should be involved as well. To get them to be partners would be quite strategic.
Yeah, not yet. I think that's a really good question. I think we started out wanting to be quite careful in the types of organizations that we reach out to. So relatively, let's say, uncomplicated organizations that we think we would be happy. So we wouldn't just let any organization sign the pledge, right? Let me put it that way. So if you have an organization that's known for its labor rights abuses, we don't want them signing the pledge in order to sort of fair wash their own internal practices, right? And so for that reason, we don't let platforms can't sign the pledge because that might be allowing them to fair wash their own practices. So we wanted to start out with something relatively a set of organizations that are relatively uncomplicated. We're expanding it out now, and I think we would be open to larger tech firms that sort of sit at the downstream node of these longer, more complicated supply chains to get involved, provided they aren't known for any significant labor rights abuses. And I realize that may be a significant caveat that I'm adding to the response here. So if you, Janine, or really anyone in the call have any leads that you might think we should follow, I would love to follow up with you.
Thanks, Mark. Mark, we have a question. Let's just take advantage that you were on this topic. Fiorella Ricobono is asking, when you say 5,000 interviews, she would like to understand the difference between the number of 5,000 and the number of 752. That is the number of workers interviewed in the Cloudwork survey this year. Could you just explain what you meant by the 5,000?
Thanks, Jonas, and thank you, Fiorella, for asking that. So the survey, the 752, that's the survey that was done by the Cloudwork research project. And the reason the survey was done is because this work is truly global, right? So we don't have the capacity to travel around the world and speak to people in each one of the countries in which they're working. Jonas, remind us in how many countries did we have respondents to the survey?
94.
94 countries, right? So obviously we couldn't do interviews with people in all of these countries. The 5,000 comes from the place-based or the geographically tethered gig work. So this is the work that we do in the 38 countries in which we evaluate these geographically tethered or place-based platforms against the principles. So, this is companies like ride-hail companies, food delivery companies. In those places, we do these synchronous, often face-to-face interviews. And so it's not 5,000 in each country, it's 5,000 over the life of the project in each country. So each year in each country, all the interviews that we've done in total, in sum, have added up to the 5,000 number. So if you actually take the number of interviews in 1 year in one country, it will be lower than the number of people surveyed for the Cloudwork research. So I think what you were asking, if I'm understanding right, is you were sort of asking why we would survey fewer people than we interview. But actually, in any given report, we're surveying more people than we interview.
Yeah, perfect, Mark. So let's go to the questions, and thank you so much. And I want to remind you that you can still share your questions here in the Q&A tool. We have Alexis Chavez asking if we've tried to contact Amazon Mechanical Turk for improvements on their platforms. And this question is super important for us to explain how we engage with platform managers. So each beginning of cycle, we reach platform managers. With several platforms, we already have a relationship. We know which manager can help us and engage with us. With other platforms, unfortunately, we need to try with the institutional channels and try to find a manager or a group of managers who could talk to us about that. But for most platforms, we are engaging in, not just for now, for the past years, and the teams that were responsible for the Cloudwork report. So we send an email, we inform that the new cycle is beginning. We invite platform managers for meetings. As I mentioned, we had a stakeholder workshop. So we invited all platforms to the stakeholder workshop, where we present the methodology, we present the league table, we inform how the process will take place, and then we get input from the platforms. During the process, so while we were doing the research, we also engaged with platforms. We asked for evidence. This year, we sent some examples of evidence that could be shared with us. Several platforms responded and provided evidence. And there is a crucial step, that is when we gather our survey evidence, desk research evidence, and platform evidence, we have a provisional score. And we send platforms this provisional score. And all the time we are talking to we're listening to workers, but we are talking to platforms to say, Do you want to discuss internally first? Do you have additional evidence for that? So do you have any kind of evidence that we haven't found that maybe can help us to understand? Because a crucial point is what Professor Mark explained. It's not that we are saying that platforms don't do that. We are saying that our team, hasn't find evidence that platforms do that. Of course, that if we cannot find evidence and if platforms do not cooperate, this is an important indicator, but we are very careful to highlight that. And we are very careful to talk to platforms and ask for those additional evidence. And unfortunately, in the case of Amazon Mechanical Turk, we didn't have those additional evidence for this year. And also, in addition to that, we talked to platform managers to see if they consider internally to promote changes. And when they promote changes that meet the criteria that we have for each threshold, this can improve platforms' final scores. And this is what happened this year for several platforms. We had platforms very open which implemented minimum wage policies, which improved their communication channels, which implemented anti-discrimination policies, Janine, that is something that you highlighted here, which improved their contract, made their contract more transparent. So we had a great engagement with those platforms, and I would like to thank on behalf of our team to the platform managers that are here and that engage with us. But of course, that engagement doesn't mean necessarily that we are agreeing with platforms all the time. So we are always discussing and try to highlight to platforms the need to improve worker conditions. A second question that was also presented by Alexis was if people can find a specific report for each platform. We don't have that. We release the report, and also what you can find in our website is an explanation for the scores. So to all platforms which scored like 1.1 or 1.2 or each one of our thresholds, we explained briefly why we scored that point. And this is important to know what the platforms are doing right. But also, when platforms don't get the score, this means, as Professor Mark explained a lot, that we couldn't find evidence that that platform was meeting all the criteria that we had for that threshold. So that's why we don't have a report per platform. Alexis also asked if we could share the comments of workers. No, and we don't do that. What we use in the case of workers is that we listen to workers and we created and we process the data as aggregated data. As I said, if the total number of workers for one platform point out a problem, then this is considered in our evidence. So before I can go to the next questions, I would like to hand over to Esther and Janine if they have additional comments on that. Esther?
Yeah, mine was actually a question rather than a comment. I was, I just wanted to understand sort of what there's a lot of unpaid tasks that a lot of the workers have to undertake. And I know you had highlighted in the report, and I'd just like you to speak a bit on it. What are the platforms saying about supporting the platform workers around unpaid tasks, and expanding that unpaid tasks, the unpaid tasks that are related to the platform. So that could be an assessment that you need to complete, setting up your profile, applying for this multiple jobs. And then there's the unpaid care work that also the platform workers are doing outside of that. So are those did you find some of these things, and what are some of the highlights that you can share with us around that? And then the second one was around payment. I do know some of them are starting to implement policies around ensuring that workers are paid for complete work. However, in Kenya, we've seen a scenario where a number of platform workers are complaining that once the payment is made, then the payment platform then holds their funds. They don't want to release their funds. And one example was a platform worker talking about their funds being held for over 2 years. And until they went on social media, on Twitter, to complain about this, then that's the only time their funds were released. So is that something that came up as you're interviewing the platform workers, especially around the non-payments? And yeah, if you could speak to that just a little bit.
Thank you so much, Esther. So before I speak a little more about our findings, Professor Mark, do you like to address this point that of unpaid and delayed payments, unpaid labor and delayed payments?
No, I think, Jonas, why don't you speak to some of the specific findings from the report on this?
Okay,
Thanks.
So what we've been seeing Cloudwork, and this was our theme in focus last year, is that unfortunately workers face, they register in a platform, they spend a lot of time looking for jobs. Sometimes they spend time when they are redoing work or talking to the clients. So we have different ways of workers to have unpaid labor. Last year, we had a very concerning statistics that were in our survey. We've seen that workers spent at least 8 hours per week on unpaid tasks. So this means if we looked at a standard labor relationship mindset, this would mean like 1 day a week, right? So this is something very concerning to us, and this is why we address this in our threshold 2.1. And this is why we talk to platforms about it, and we have been having changes to address that. We have, as we highlighted in the report, Appen implemented 3 changes, like to help workers how to get more jobs. Come Up, that is one of the top rated platforms, also did that. So you have platforms trying to create some kind of mechanisms to avoid that you have a kind of a spiral where newcomers cannot get a job, therefore they cannot get experience, and clients normally will look for more experienced workers, right? So this is why we were discussing this with platforms, and we have been seeing some positive responses to that. Regarding the payment, this is our threshold 1.1. So our threshold 1.1 means that platforms need to have mechanisms to ensure that workers are paid for completed work on time. And we've been seeing that several platforms implemented, for instance, scroll systems. So a client needs to pay to deposit the money, and then if there is some kind of disagreement about the job, there are some mediation systems. So this is happening, and we've seen that. And that's why, for instance, that the threshold 1.1 is the threshold where we could grant more points to platforms. We're seeing that in freelance platforms, and we've seen also systems that are interesting even in microwork platforms. Regarding the late payments, this is also something that we assess. So we assess as part of the threshold 1.1 that platforms need to ensure that there is a reasonable time frame for workers to get paid. And normally what we've been seeing is that platforms, they are improving a little bit in the way that workers, they have, for instance, a deadline for workers to receive money. This is less than 1 month. So this year, this was not necessarily pointed out as a huge problem. So I believe that this is something that platforms are working on, but this is an important question that we will assess in the next years because it's part of our threshold. So I would like to bring here the question from Elena, and I know that Janine, Esther, and Mark will like to talk about it. Elena is asking about if the precarious working conditions of gig economy can be resolved through platform actions, or if there is a need of legislations. And if you agree that there is a need for regulation, what should those regulations address? Janine, do you want to start? And then Esther and Mark.
Sure. I think both forms of regulation, let's call them regulation, are important. So you can have the private regulation that the government, the corporate terms of services is a form of regulation, very important. It certainly influences whatever might happen in the regulatory sphere. That's critical. Now, whether, especially for cloud work, whether we have some sort of international regulation and national regulation in this area. Certainly, I think the work of Fairwork shows that that could be something that could be useful. Of course, that will be something that's going to be decided at the standard setting discussion that we're going to be having at the ILO when the tripartite constituents decide that. But the whole point of having the standard setting discussion is so that there is some sort of regulation. There has been the social partners and governments are aware of a lot of the deficiencies in decent work, which is why they've put this on the agenda of the International Labor Conference. So certainly that would be something that is something that is desirable by many of the constituents of the ILO. And if it does go into effect, then it would impact, and it should impact the terms of services of the different companies. So yeah, both are important.
Perfect. Esther?
I agree with Janine that both are really important. They are those basic principles that the platform owners have to adhere to. No child labor, do no harm. So they do have a responsibility to the platform workers and to the users to ensure that they are some of those practices. But at the same time, then the governments have to legislate, and pass policies that are going to protect their workers. In a similar way, where most corporate organizations are governed by labor laws within the countries they operate in, then the same should apply for platform owners. So if there are basic social protections that can be provided and they need to be addressed by the law, then that's very important. But at the same time, for them as themselves, there's a duty to care for the platform workers and even for the users who are going to interact with these platform workers.
Thank you, Esther. Mark, do you want to add your bits here?
Sure, thanks. I would invite anyone who's listening who thinks that precarious working conditions in the gig economy might be resolved solely through platforms changing their terms and conditions to have a look at any of our league tables that we've published. Now, why am I saying that? Because what do the league tables show? That almost no companies anywhere in any of the league tables that we produce are achieving even these basic minimum standards of fair work, right? It's all of the league tables show effectively companies left to their own devices under current regulation. So current regulation is not doing its job. If current regulation was doing its job, we wouldn't need this project. We could pack up, go home, and get on with something else. Now it's not doing its job, right? So that doesn't mean, I'm not saying this to say that what we're doing is not a useful intervention. Of course, it's a useful intervention because as we've seen, there's a significant number of companies who are willing and able to shift their practices once it's shown that things don't have to be black and white. There's tweaks you can make here and there. There's things that you can do. You can inspire through positive examples, but that's not enough. That's not sufficient to create this floor of decent work for everyone that every worker deserves. And so we absolutely need legislative and intervention. It's essential. It has to happen. But when we're talking about cloud work, we have a problem, right? Cloud work is global. Cloud work is transacted at a planetary scale. And so there's sort of a race to the bottom dynamic when it comes to regulation as well, right? If you think of a country that is home to a lot of cloud workers, if they tomorrow enact some legislation that would impose minimum standards that might increase costs for anyone outsourcing work to that country, what will happen? Those jobs can very quickly, in an instant, flow to another place. So there's a very active disincentive for countries unilaterally to impose any minimum standards on cloud work. And this is exactly why there's a need for kind of international standards, for international movement that's not just unilateral movement by single countries. So I think we have to see that, and we also have to see movement on the supply side. So on the demand side, sorry. So There's a few countries in the world that basically are the site of the vast majority of demand for a lot of this work. And I think we could take inspiration from things like Germany's supply chain law, where we think about imposing standards at the demand side that can percolate through the whole network. So I hope we can engage in a lot more conversations about this in the future.
Thank you, Mark. And now we have a question from Six Silberman. Thank you, Six. Six is asking about the overall profitability or the lack thereof of labor platforms and how this is something under-discussed when we consider the causes of the poor working conditions on labor platforms. So he asks Dr. Berg if there is any way that a focus on unprofitability of many platforms might help to establish common ground between researchers, workers, and government representatives on one hand, and the employers' representatives on the other. In his view, it seems that present the employers' representatives at the global level are not noting that most platform business are not profitable. So, Janine, would you like to address that?
Sure. So profitability or unprofitability can't be an excuse for poor working conditions. And the Webb's writing in the early 1900s said this very clearly. If a business is only succeeding because there's a high social cost to what it's doing, then it shouldn't exist. They called them parasitic industries. And I think that is true of all businesses. So we need to have some sort of minimum floor that respects decent standards. Now, the unprofitability in the platform economy, you do see it in some of the local geographically tethered platforms because of a lot of competition, but a lot of it is really also a lot of things that they're spending money on, the marketing, the advertising, the lobbying. Professor Graham mentioned in his discussion the over 200 million that was spent by Uber and Lyft to defeat Proposition 22 in California, or to support Proposition 22 in California. So there's a lot of money that's being spent by these companies. They're not turning a profit, but I don't think it's necessarily because the workers are getting too much, because the workers are bringing everything to the work. So if you think of a taxi, taxi Uber type driver, they're providing the car, they're providing the gasoline, they're doing the service, and basically they're being paid, and then Uber makes money off them through the commission that they charge. So there's nothing that could really be done. I mean, the only thing that would be done more would be to squeeze them more to raise the profitability, and that's, we've already seen that they're being squeezed too much. In the area of cloud work, I don't know. I haven't really seen the data too much on profitability. It seems to me that it's not necessarily unprofitable. I think that actually is an area where you have more profitability. Certainly Amazon Mechanical Turk is not suffering in terms of profits. These are a lot of big firms or firms that are applying for very big firms that are very profitable. I just looked at very quickly when I saw the question, the earnings statement of Appen. Appen has been in business for 25 years. They regularly report profits, and they predict a global demand for training data that will grow by 2027 of 22 billion. So it is very much a growth market. So to me, that doesn't seem like an issue.
Thank you, Janine. There's an interesting question from Claudia Mara. She's asking about our threshold 1.2. So how can very different minimum income levels be combined with a transnational marketplace logic? So when we talk about minimum wage, how do we sort that out? And what our threshold says is that platforms need to have a policy for that. And that policy needs to address the local minimum wage. And what we've been seeing is that some platforms, they have implemented policies to ensure the local minimum wage. But of course that we have a challenge after the policy is created, that is to verify if it's working and how it's working. And this is something that workers need to do. So workers need to try to understand and appeal in case those policies are not working. And what we try to do as a project is that year after year, in our research, listening to workers, we try to understand if those policies being implemented are being effective or not. So of course, this is a huge problem, as Claudia has highlighted. So how do you coordinate so many income levels? But I believe that once a platform has a policy for that, workers can reach the platform and show, I'm living in Brazil, Indonesia, in the UK, and here the official minimum wage is this, and so I cannot receive less than that. And I believe that this is a way to do that. I don't know, Mark raised his hand. Mark, do you like to add some bits to it?
Yeah, just to add, I think it's a good question. And I think Jonas has done a great job of explaining how that's, how companies can actually address this. I just want to zoom back a bit and talk about the need for this, because when we proposed this, this principle 1.2, that all workers everywhere, irrespective of what they're doing or what platform they're on or what type of classification they're on, that every worker should earn at least their local minimum wage. Some people looked at us like we had three heads. You know, it goes against the sort of commonly understood logic of how cloud platforms work, where you put a job onto the platform and then workers from all around the globe can bid on it, and it shouldn't really matter where the worker is, according to the logic of most cloud platforms. But that's a conscious choice, right? That's a choice made by the platform management, by the designers of the platform, to not pay any attention to that, to not pay any attention to the fact that every worker should be earning at least their local minimum wage, irrespective of what type of contract they're on, irrespective of where they are and what they're doing. And so we think this is really essential. How can you have fair work? How can you have decent work if you're earning below your local minimum wage? Now, minimum wages, of course, aren't living wages in most places, and ultimately everyone should be earning a living wage. And that concept is embedded in our gig work principles. But the minimum wage has to be a start, just to help move us there to this logic of making sure that no worker can fall beneath it. So it's not an easy problem to solve, especially with the current design of most platforms, but it is something that is doable. Some platforms have really stepped up here and tried to think about how this can be implemented. And the idea behind embedding it into the principles was precisely to try to think about this in a more medium-term or long-term way, to make sure that we're finding ways of having this conversation, to make sure that no one can be earning below their local minimum wage. So thanks for asking that question.
Thanks, Mark. And we have a question from Sana Ahmed asking if the survey data can be made publicly available. And no, we do not share the survey data. We have rules inside the project in the university. So the survey is used, as I explained early, to understand where we have some problems, and then we point out to platforms that we have a problem in that specific threshold. We have, Mark, do you want to jump in?
Just to add one thing to that, I think one of the key things that we try and do in the project is make sure that we protect all of the workers who speak to us. So, you know, workers can be telling us quite sensitive things, issues that they faced, harms that they've experienced. And it's crucial for us to not allow those conversations to leave the room, so to speak, between them and us. So we absolutely don't share any details of anything a worker says to us to the platform specifically. We go to great lengths to try and keep that barrier, to make sure that there can be no retribution on any worker who's told us anything sensitive. But part of our process that's sort of embedded in our ethical guidelines that we follow is just making sure we don't share, we tell the worker categorically, we are not going to share anything specific you've told us outside of this conversation. We'll talk about it in an anonymized way, perhaps. We'll talk about it in an aggregated way, but the data that you are giving to us will not leave this bilateral relationship between you and us. So I'm afraid it's absolutely impossible for us to violate that agreement that we have with all the workers that we've been in touch with.
Thank you, Mark. And I would like to add that if you read the report and all Fairworks reports, we have a section called Worker Stories. And on those sections, we do not review, of course, the name of workers, and we reach workers asking, of course, for consent and to see, do you want to tell your story to our report? And we have some workers who are willing to tell these stories. And in these years, we have new stories, very interesting. And as you can see, when you read the report, we have workers that have, they have complaints, concerns, but also sometimes enjoy their experience on the platform. So I believe that those stories, they help us to understand the complexity and the nuance we have in platform work. Now we have a question, and I will direct that question to Esther. And Titilayo Taiwo asks, she says that Cloudwork adoption in Africa is still very low. So how will the report support the change in behavior of Africans around labor? From our end, what I would like to highlight is that when the report shows the best practices and the problems, I believe that the report is helping to shed light in the platform economy, and it's helping to encouraging platforms to improve their conditions. And I believe that when they improve their conditions, they have more possibility to succeed, not only in Africa, but also in other regions. But we have Esther here. So Esther, please, would you like to address the challenges in the development of cloud work in Africa?
I'm sure. I think one of the things we see around cloud work in Africa is that there may be quite a number of platform workers, but they're not being recognized because some of them are getting on these platforms and registering themselves as being of a different race. So they get lost within the numbers. And the reason they do this is that they want to be more competitive. They believe that, the name, someone seeing their name or location is going to discriminate them against getting access to jobs. So one of the things, as this report starts to come out, and as platforms implement non-discrimination policies, then we will see a lot more young Africans being confident enough to portray themselves as they are, and share their profiles with their names and their locations and their live locations. There is a lot of work also happening around sensitization, sharing more information, getting platform workers or even young people to understand that platform work is considered work and can be a source of decent decent work for them. So a lot of them are interested in getting on these platforms. We have instances where, because of the stringent requirements of platforms for profiles, then we do have quite a number who are still doing gig work, but they're doing it under one person's profile. So I think the more we see these policies coming around non-discrimination, sorting out issues around fair pay, and even non-payment, then we will see a lot more activity coming in from the continent, and we will see a lot more of the young people and of gig workers being confident to just showcase where they're coming from, and their innovation and creativity based on without fear that by presenting themselves with an African name or with an African location is going to reduce their chances of getting access to work. So yeah, I do believe that this report is going to help with that as well.
Janine, do you want to add something, since you coordinated the World Outlook of 2021 about platform work, and ILO presented a very, very complex and complete picture of platform economy in the world, how you see the challenges of the Global South and specifically Africa?
I mean, in some ways, I think the challenges are pretty much global. Some of the particular challenges that you have in the Global South have to do a little bit with access to the work, especially if you have infrastructure issues. But the same problems with working conditions are true of all the platforms. If you don't have that dialogue with the platforms, or the transparency, if you have discrimination, all of those things are affecting workers across the world. Certainly from a terms of earnings perspective, it's more interesting work for people in the global South. It has, it has a better prospect for them, but you still see a lot of issues, especially you have a lot of very highly educated workers who are going into this work and not really using their skills enough, and you don't have enough opportunities really to develop skills. You see that also in amongst people in the global South. So I don't see the differences as too distinct. I think that's why I really think these international discussions about platform work are really important.
Thank you, Janine. So moving on to the next question, Fiorella again asks, what causes a platform to lose points from one year to the next? This is a very important question, and it's important to clarify. First, as I mentioned, we have each new round of ratings, we have a new survey. So the survey results can vary, and this has been happening because we had a survey this year pointing out problems to a platform in one specific threshold. So maybe this survey this year revealed some significant levels of non-payment or significant levels of unpaid labor. And this is something that is crucial for us to not being able to award a point. Or maybe we had a survey last year which has shown a problem and not necessarily this year. So we have platforms to which we couldn't award a specific point last year, and now we are awarding. And we have the same when it's the case of platforms who got some points last year and are not getting this year. So the survey, it's a crucial factor that impacts the final scores. Another factor is that we improve the operationalization of our principles. We didn't have principle change from last year to this year, but we discussed how we can operationalize things, issues, problems that workers raise in the survey or that we find in the desk research. So this is just in a level of how interpret the thresholds and the criteria. So this is not a change of the principles. When the principles are changed, as I mentioned before, we present the new principles and the new thresholds in our stakeholder workshop. We communicate with platform managers to say, these are the principles of these years. This is how this is going to happen. We didn't have that this year, but we had some points about the operationalization. And when we send the platforms the provisional score, we have this situation. So since we are now moving I think we are out of time. We have 3 minutes. I just would like to address our 3 last questions. First of all, Philip asks, if MTurk pays automatically every 3 days, why didn't the threshold 1.1 was granted? And this is a good question to understand that each threshold has different criteria. So we have, as I explained before, in threshold 1.1, you're talking about if the payment is late or not, if you have mechanisms to ensure workers are paid or not. So we need to find evidence for each one of these criteria. And this is the same for all platforms. If a platform meets, for instance, 4 criterions and not the 5th bullet point, we cannot award the point. Elena is asking here if like the risks of the legislation, and unfortunately, we don't have time to get in more depth in that, but I believe that we'll have other events to discuss the legislation. And we have Nahima Nascimento Faleiros talking about the local minimum wage. She's saying that for platforms from the north, it could be profitable, not so far from workers from the south. It's a complex issue because we're talking about the International Division of Labor. So this is, as Mark said, this is a complex issue and we need to keep discussing that. So now that we're running out of time, I'd like to hand over to Janine and Esther to say their final words, and then we can wrap up and finish.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for the invitation. It's been a really wonderful discussion, but more importantly, thank you for all of the work that you're doing, and please continue the good work.
Thank you so much, Janine. And we would like to thank you for being here with us. In all the launches, we have been inviting the ILO because ILO is crucial to this discussion, and especially in the convention debate. Esther?
Thank you very much for the invite. It was very great. It was really insightful hearing about the work you're doing and seeing more about the report. I'm happy to continue this conversation even outside of this event, and congratulations for the work you're doing.
Thank you so much, Esther. Mark, your last words, and then we can finish.
Oh, just thanks to everyone for tuning in. I hope we can keep sharing the work that we're doing. Just a reminder to everyone about our pledge. So we mean it when we ask everyone who's listening to have a think about signing up to the Fairwork Pledge. It really helps us go back to platforms and say, look, it's not just us who care about this. There's all of these actors, all of these people, all of these organizations that think every worker should have a job characterized by decent work, by fair work standards. So you can find more about the pledge in the link that's in the chat there, or you can contact me, Jonas, or anyone else on the team, and we'd be more than happy to explain more details about how it works. So just thank you to, also, let me just say thank you to Jonas and to the whole team who's worked on this report. A huge amount of work has gone into it. So thanks Jonas and the team, and thank you Janine and Esther for taking the time and joining us on this panel today, and for everyone who's tuned in.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Janine, Esther, and I would like to stress the thanks that Mark just said to our colleagues that made this launch possible, our communications team, and all the Fairwork colleagues, and thank for everyone who attended, to the platform managers, workers associations, researchers, and we hope to keep discussing the findings with you. Bye-bye.